Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Wii U. This is an action-adventure game and the follow-up to Assassin's Creed 3. It was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in October of 2013 for the previous gen of consoles, and then it later got rolled out to the other systems. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons, the first of which being that this really isn't much of an Assassin's Creed game. It's more of a pirate game with the Assassin's Creed name slapped on it. And that's interesting purely on the basis of us not really having all that many pirate games. I mean, think about it. In recent memory, you had this and Risen 3, and that's kind of it. The only other pirate games I can think of off the top of my head are things like Sea Dogs or Sid Meier's Pirates or things like that. Stuff that's quite a bit further back in history, and it wasn't necessarily all that popular per se. So the question ultimately becomes here, did this thing, in setting out to do something rather different from the previous Assassin's Creed games, actually manage to accomplish it? And more importantly, how is it compared to Assassin's Creed 3, considering that AC3 was downright awful? Well, as far as presentation goes, I do have to say that this is not only a step up from the previous game, but at times it is downright gorgeous, namely in the environments, and especially when you're out on the sea. The effects that they've done with the water, the just sheer detail they put into the environments is stunning at times. The character modeling, animation, and all that sort of thing, not quite as much. It's still pretty good for the most part, but let's face it, the environment artists are always going to be the best part of the Assassin's Creed games, but they really outdid themselves here. I am very impressed with the visuals in this game, in the environments. And it's down to even the small touches, like just the rain effects and how rain moves along the environment so well and things like that. So the visuals are very impressive. And like most of the other games in this series, the sound design is well done. They've got a very competent voice cast, with some characters being voiced extremely well, others just being voiced fairly well, but none of it is bad. They've done a very good job with that. The sound effects themselves are generally very, very good. I mean, cannons sound pretty beefy, gunfire sounds pretty beefy, the actual melee sounds are better than they were before, so they've done a very good job with all that sort of thing. And then there's the music, which is alright. Some of it is really good, other parts of it are just okay. But again, none of this presentation is outright bad, except for one thing that relates to when you're not in the Animus, and that's the FOV of walking around in the first-person segments of the game. Luckily, that's not a huge problem, considering how rarely you really have to do that. So it's still really annoying, and it's actually pretty headache-inducing when that FOV comes in, because, again, it's really low. It has to be somewhere around 60 to 65. And while that may be relatively acceptable on a TV screen, it's just not at all acceptable on PC. And there's nothing you can really do to fix it, so that becomes pretty problematic. But other than that, the presentation is extremely well done. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this can be divided into two different sections that are relatively intertwined. The first section is the frame story, where you play as an employee of Abstergo Entertainment who is going back into the memories of Desmond Miles, who is amusingly called a donor for the memories here, in order to research material for Abstergo's upcoming video game about those events. But as you know, if you know anything about the Assassin's Creed games, you know that Abstergo is actually a Templar organization, and there's clearly a separate motive behind what they're doing, and that becomes more and more apparent as you go through the game. This particular part of the game is actually downright awful. They should not have included it whatsoever. It does nothing to add to the story whatsoever. It's frankly just irritating when the game takes you out of the Animus to go through these segments where you're in first person and you're walking around Abstergo Industries very, very slowly, and typically doing some busy work for the assassin infiltrators of Abstergo Entertainment. And as is the series' fashion, the present-day stuff gets completely, utterly ridiculous as it goes further and further in. So you end up just not giving a crap, and the ultimate ending of it is just nonsense, basically. So what you're really going to be more interested in is the life of Edward Kenway, which is the inner story to this, and what you, as the Abstergo Entertainment researcher, are going through. So, who is Edward Kenway? Well, he is a Welsh pirate, and you start off the game, and he's just a pirate. He ends up getting shipwrecked, and he finds this assassin who was on the ship with him has survived. And so he tracks the guy down, ends up having to kill him. And he assumes the guy's identity and finds out that he was supposed to deliver something to some high-up people for a considerable amount of money. See, Edward's main motivation is money. He is a pirate, of course, but he starts off the game with this idea of he's going to go and become a pirate or a privateer or whatever he can really get out in the Caribbean, and come back to his wife later on with a large sum of money so they can basically live an easy life. But after he ends up going to these strange individuals to turn in this thing for the reward, he finds out that they are in fact Templars, and that this guy, who he has assumed the identity of, is in fact a traitor to the Assassin Order, and it goes from there. The plot ends up basically becoming Edward as a pirate going through all these different things that you would pretty much expect a pirate to do anyway, and eventually going head-to-head with the Templars because they are threatening the pirate lifestyle. It does get more complicated than that once he gets introduced to the Order itself, and it's kind of interesting to actually see things play out, although at times you're just sitting there going, huh? What? Because they just blatantly fly in the face of historical records at times, and it gets kind of ridiculous. So, even though they aren't particularly historically accurate, what they did do absolutely is nail the pirate feel. This is helped immensely by the supporting cast of famous pirates, where you'll run into people like, of course, Blackbeard, who is pretty interesting, actually, in the game, and all these larger-than-life pirate characters who are actually pretty well characterized, even though they may not necessarily be historically accurate. They're actually just fun to run around with and listen to the weird things they say and all that sort of thing. So what they did was they nailed the pirate feel with things like that, with the way you actually play the game, and it does that very, very well. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like an Assassin's Creed game. Oh, don't get me wrong, the gameplay's still there. You're still doing pretty much the exact same things you were doing in Assassin's Creed 3, just with much less bugs and glitches. So you're still running around slaughtering enemies by the hundreds because the enemy AI is mind-bogglingly stupid. You're still finding that the game is painfully easy in the combat department. Still finding viewpoints to synchronize and see more of the environment and things like that. You're still exploring, finding collectibles, doing various missions, whether it be assassin contracts or they introduce naval contracts in this, or Templar hunts, or whatever it may well be. And so it's all very, very familiar from a gameplay mechanics standpoint, but it, again, does not feel like an Assassin's Creed game. The Assassin side of things is actually pretty heavily downplayed for most of the game, and it really does feel like this game suffers from an identity crisis. On the one hand, it is an Assassin's Creed game. I already mentioned it does pretty much all the same stuff you saw in the previous Assassin's Creed game, but then it has all of this pirate stuff to go along with it, where you're sailing around the Caribbean, finding ships to take over so you can get their loot, whatever it may well be, whether it's sugar, rum, other things like that, or resources to upgrade your ship later on, like metal or wood. And as you're going through the game, you're going to be doing that quite a lot, so it would behoove the naval combat system to be good, right? Well, it's alright, I have to say. It's not bad, but it's not particularly great either. It does get really repetitive really quickly, and that's its major downfall. And that's actually the major downfall of most of this game, but I'll get to that in a moment. The naval stuff is handled pretty much the same as Assassin's Creed 3, just better polished, more detailed. And so what you're doing is you're sailing around and you'll come across a ship that you want to raid, for example. And so you start attacking that ship. You have your broadside cannons, which do a lot of damage. You have swivel guns that will hit the various weak points to do some pretty massive damage, but you have to hold the button down to do so. You've got a mortar for long-range fighting. You've got some fire barrels that you can use, but honestly, I never figured out how to use them, so I didn't actually use the fire barrels, but they are available if you want to use them. And as soon as you manage to whittle a enemy ship down to a certain degree of health, you can board it. And when you board it, you will be able to hop over to the enemy ship and complete a few objectives to seize the ship. You always have to kill a certain number of enemies, and then there's always a secondary or tertiary objective, where it would be things like killing very specific enemies, like the captain of the ship, or scouts, or whatever, or just cutting down the enemy's flag so that they can no longer have that inspiration, or whatever it may well be. And then once you've captured the ship, you can do one of three things with it. You can either repair your own ship, the Jackdaw, with it. You can use it to lower your wanted level, which will make sure that pirate hunters don't come after you. Or you can send it to Kenway's fleet. Now, the fleet mechanics are pretty much what have replaced the Assassin Order stuff from the previous games. And it's not really all that compelling. It's just a way to get some extra money. And everything runs on a timer, as you'd expect. You do get some naval battles that you can do, but it's incredibly simplistic stuff. And ultimately, it kind of becomes a waste of time, other than just to sit there and be like, well, here's some extra money, which is really helpful in upgrading the Jackdaw or buying Edward some better equipment. And all of it's a pretty linear upgrade train, really. Particularly with regards to the Jackdaw, you just get varying degrees of improvement to your ship. For example, with hull armor, it's just a flat upgrade in how much health the ship has over time. And as you go more and more into it, the higher the costs get, both monetarily, which you have to buy all of these upgrades too, and with regards to the resources, where eventually it gets to the point where you have to raid some pretty hefty ships in order to actually be able to afford upgrades. So you kind of hit the point where it becomes a grind, actually. And that becomes pretty problematic, because even though the naval combat is sound, it loses steam very, very quickly, especially when you figure out that you're going to be doing the exact same thing over and over and over again ad nauseum. And they try to spice up some things with the naval combat by throwing in enemy forts that you can take over, where you go up to the fort, you have to shell its defenses for a while until they're gone, then you can dock with the fort and run up there and complete some objectives to actually be able to take over the fort, which is always killing enemy officers and then going straight to the enemy's war room in order to eliminate the fort commander and then take over the fort. And after you've done so, it becomes a friendly fort that will actually attack vessels that come near that are enemy. So you have two factions that you're going to run into in this game. You have the Spanish and the British. So it will actually attack their ships as they go by, whereas if you go by the fort by yourself, it will start attacking you automatically. So it would behoove you to actually take out these forts, but they're not necessarily all that easy. They do dish out quite a lot of pain, and they can dish out pain at a pretty long range too. So you end up having some issues where the combat just ends up dragging on and on and on for certain engagements. And particularly if you try to go after legendary ships, you're going to need as many upgrades as you can possibly get, and even then you're going to still need some luck, because legendary ships are frankly kind of BS. They are ridiculously powerful, and there's really not much hope you can have of beating them on your own, unless you're just insanely upgraded and you happen to be pretty lucky as well. So if you want to go after those, you do in fact need some pretty heavy grinding to get to that point. And ultimately, the naval combat just wears itself thin over the course of the first few hours of the game. It eventually just becomes a chore, which is kind of sad, really. And it's the one thing that actually tried to spice the game up the most. So while that succeeds for a while, eventually it just kind of falls flat on its face. It's not bad, but it just becomes boring. And ultimately, there's not all that much you can do with boring. And when you compare it to the rest of the game, where it's still got the same kinds of problems that the older Assassin's Creed games did, namely the big one being that it's way too easy, let's just say that it wears out its welcome. And really, that's the biggest problem apart from the blatant identity crisis that this game has. It wears out its welcome. It becomes way too repetitive way too quickly, and then it stays that way for the rest of the game. I couldn't tell you how many times I've had to tail targets in this particular game. It seems like it's the game's favorite pastime, is making you tail people and just sit there and hide from their view while you listen in on their conversations, things like that. It gets so tedious. And so it falls to other elements of the game to actually keep it elevated. And this is where things just kind of fall apart for it. It's not a bad game, but the supporting cast is not enough to keep the repetition from becoming problematic. The story is just completely absurd for the most part, and honestly, when you're playing as Edward, even though he's a way more interesting character than Connor was, oh jeez, the things he's doing just aren't all that interesting for the most part, and it just feels like more of the same for the Assassin's Creed series. The game is just way too easy. It can't handle its own gameplay in that regard. And so what you're left with is really the best game since Assassin's Creed 2 in the series, but that's not saying all that much. Brotherhood was alright, but since then it's been just nothing but downhill until you get to Assassin's Creed 4, which feels like they tried to breathe some new life into the game, and it does work at times, but ultimately the main strengths of this game are in things like the Templar hunts, where even though you're doing the exact same thing you're used to doing, the actual subplots of these particular Templar hunts are actually fairly interesting, and it feels like the first time they've actually included some proper, interesting side activities in the Assassin's Creed games. But that's only fleeting. The majority of the game is just repetition, and it's not particularly great repetition. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. Like I said, it is the best game in the Assassin's Creed series since Assassin's Creed 2. But again, that's not saying much. I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.